Oh. All right, well, it's the day after Thanksgiving 2015, so it's November 27th, and remarkably, we're having very un-West Texas-like weather. It rained out the parade yesterday, and today we're getting, we might get 10% of El Paso's annual rainfall today. It just rained and rained, so but that's the backdrop. I wanted to see if my folks can summarize and tell briefly the story of how your folks, and then actually your folks came to be in West Texas, the desert Southwest.
Okay, I'll start with my dad, my father. He was born in Chocowinity, North Carolina, and when he was just a young man, his mother died, Martha Jarvis Hooten, and his older sister Ruby, gifted musician, took up housekeeping and kept the house together, but then Ruby sadly died when she was 21. Ruby was a great piano player. My dad told me that she would play the piano on a summer evening and a crowd would gather out in front of the home. But once Ruby died, the family just started breaking up, and my dad told me at Ruby's funeral, my dad and Aunt Mildred were the youngest two, and Aunt Mildred said, at I think age 7, "What's going to become of us, William?" And my dad, William Jarvis Hooten, said, "Don't worry, Millie, I'll look out after you." And my dad became a telegrapher, and he worked in Atlanta for quite a time, and did all kinds of things, but he had two brothers that went west, Brother Leland and Brother Archie. They both had tuberculosis. The Western Union operation was thought to be a tuberculosis incubator. I guess men would work for many hours, and once they started working, they wouldn't let them go home, and so tuberculosis was common. So my dad decided he had enough of Atlanta and being a young man alone, and he decided to go out to Albuquerque, New Mexico to be with Brother Leland. And he rode the train, and the evening he got there, he went to see Leland and asked about Leland. They talked a bit, and Leland was really sick with tuberculosis. My dad went in with Leland's wife and had dinner and went back, and Leland had died. My dad's brother that he looked up to had died the day he went to see him. So there was another brother, Archie, and they made friends. They got together, and they were close friends. And my dad always admired Archie. And they talked to a Union man, and Western Union officials saw them talking to innocent young people, and they were fired and banned from Western Union. So they came to El Paso and got a job telegraphing for the railroad. This was a big railroad intersection, El Paso. And then my dad wound up being with the Associated Press telegrapher. And one of his assignments was Douglas, Arizona. So he went over to Douglas, and he was telegraphing at the AP office, and next in that same building was the Douglas International, a newspaper that my grandfather on my mother's side had founded in Douglas, Arizona. And he noticed this healthy, fresh, pretty girl helping set type at her dad's newspaper office. And one thing led to another, and they met and courted a little bit, and then my dad came back to El Paso for something, and he told his brother Archie, he said, "I met the prettiest, nicest girl in Douglas." And Archie said, "William, you go back over to Douglas, you meet that girl, you court her, and you marry her. That's what you need." My dad did that. He went over and courted my mom. Grace Bull was her maiden name. My grandmother, Cynthia Pierce Bull. My dad told me that Grandma Bull asked him not to marry my mother Grace until she had finished her college education. She wanted her to be an educated woman going to the University of Arizona, Dad said I make that promise. So she was a 1922 graduate in May, and they married in June of 1922 on the back porch of my grandmother's house in Douglas. Then they came to El Paso and boarded the railroad, rode the railroad up to Cloudcroft, New Mexico, and had their honeymoon at the Cloudcroft Lodge. And came back, and my dad was a telegrapher in El Paso. That was a real good assignment. And one thing led to another. He became a newspaper man, and then worked his way up the ranks and became the editor of the El Paso Times. On October the 20th, 1940, he became the editor, and he served for 30 years, the longest editor in the history of the El Paso Times. And of course, my mother, after they married, she followed my dad to El Paso, so that's how they got here. One generation back, I don't know how much you want, but one generation back, my grandfather, who founded the Douglas International, before that, he founded the newspaper in Tombstone, Arizona, and before that, he founded the newspaper in Clifton, Arizona, all in Arizona territory.
That was rugged territory at that time.
This was rugged.
Shortly after the Civil War, still a lot of, wasn't it? I mean, that would have been the 1880s, 1890s?
More, yeah, 1890s or so.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, it was you had to be made of sturdy stuff to function in the territory of Arizona. Still lots of problems, outlaws, and things were hard to deal with, but still, he founded the newspaper in Clifton. That's where my mother was born in 1899, December the 4th. 1899, so she's lived in those 2 centuries. But then he heard that Tombstone they just made this wonderful discovery of copper and gold and silver, and he moved to Tombstone and founded a newspaper there. And then the mines flooded, and many people thought Tombstone was going to disappear without their main source of income. So then he moved to Douglas in 1904 and founded the Douglas International. That man, my grandfather, who died at age 52 of pneumonia, was quite a man. Gosh, my dad used to say, I wish I had known Mr. Bull. He came out this way. He had family in Oregon, and he and another man drove a herd of horses to the New Mexico territory around Eddy County, and they had driven the horses to Eddy County, and my grandmother, whom he married, Grandma Bull, Cynthia Pierce, took the train from Gonzales, Texas, out to Eddy County, New Mexico, to visit her sister. And she and Carlton Emmons Bull met and fell in love and married, and that's how that all came about.
This is the first I've heard of this story. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's real historic.
Yeah, a very interesting story.
There were no cars at that time.
Right.
It was all horse carriages and...
This is before radio,
Yeah.
TV, internet,
Yeah.
credit
Telephone.
cards, telephone, that's right.
Around 1890. Well, in 1881, I think, I don't know the year, but around then, my grandfather was the editor of the Las Cruces newspaper. And I think that's before he was married to Grandma. And as the editor, he was in charge of the Las Cruces. I think it was the Las Cruces Democrat. And somebody wrote a letter to the editor. This was soon after Billy the Kid had been killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett. And the letter to the editor said that Pat Garrett was cowardly. He shot Billy the Kid in the dark without offering to take him prisoner, and he called him a murderer. Pat Garrett was enraged. He was just terribly angry, and he went to the newspaper office looking for my grandfather because he thought the editor should not have allowed that newspaper belittling him to be printed. And so he went into, and he couldn't find him or something, and he came back with a warrant for his arrest with criminal libel lawsuit. He was going to arrest my grandfather. The story my dad told me is the people of Las Cruces blocked Garrett from going into the office to arrest my grandfather. And later, an attorney named A.B. Fall defended Carlton Emmons Bull, my grandfather, and the charges were dismissed. And then that's when I guess he left New Mexico to go out to Arizona, where maybe it was a little more civilized, I guess.
more civilized.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's my grandparents on my mother's side. And I don't know a lot about my grandparents on my father's side, since Martha, my grandmother, died relatively young, and I didn't know much of my grandfather. My dad didn't tell me a lot about that, just some little things, little snippets. But I'll let that be enough for now.
That's great. That was very succinct, and you have developed good speaking skills with a lot of practice. That told the story just right.
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to take a break and have glasses of water, and then it's Mom's turn. Remarkably, her family was settled in Arizona in those hard territorial days as well.
Here we are, back.
Right. Had an opportunity to chat about some other things, and actually got going on politics and the relevance of the Stars and Bars Confederate flag, and Dad made some very valid points. But we do want to get the history of Mom's family incorporated. Dad, I'd kind of like to hear talk more about that on another occasion.
Okay.
But this is a family history session. So it's interesting. Mom's father moved out west to Arizona specifically from a southern state similar to Dad's father. So tell us the story, Mom. Or start wherever you'd like.
Well, I'll start with my grandma's family, because I really know more about them than about my father's family or why they came to Arizona. But my grandmother was Marguerite Glass. That was her married name, and I just can't think of her maiden name. But she was born and reared in Virginia, and it was shortly after the Civil War, and a story that I remember them telling is that after the Civil War, so many of the young men, of the men in the South had been killed, that the surviving men would sort of adopt the family of one of the soldiers that had been killed. And I think that happened in my grandmother's family, that either her father was killed or he adopted the family of another man who, including the wife. So, and I don't have any backup for that, but that's what I understand. And she grew up in in Virginia, the state of Virginia. My grandfather, I can't think of his first name. I'm just drawing a blank. But I think he was in Oklahoma at one point, but visited Virginia, and he was walking past the house, and he looked in the yard and saw this lovely young woman. I think he was about 10 years older than she was. Anyway, they got together and married, and he became a teacher, and he taught business courses, and he got a job way off in Arizona, and my grandmother's family just thought she was going they'd never see her again.
Which was possible at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, from Virginia to Arizona,
There was
and
a-
now it's a 2-hour flight, but at
Right.
that time it was
It
2
was-
weeks perhaps.
Oh, it was a long journey. As it happened, they did about every 7 years, they would go, they would take their family and go back to Virginia for a visit. But anyway, Grandpa was a teacher in Phoenix, Arizona, a high school teacher. And they were able to manage on his income. They had a house with acreage. They had cows, and my grandma would milk the cows and make butter, and all of the things that we no longer, we don't know, we don't comprehend what people used to do. Now,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I see that we're coming near the end of the tape. Let me
Oh.
get it put on a fresh tape and we'll resume.
Oh,
okay.
it looks like good power there.
Yes, we're in good shape now. Okay, and so Mom's had a chance to think of even better stories to tell. So I'm sorry for the interruption. Can you resume where you left off?
Okay, I'll resume where my grandparents on my mother's side, the Glasses, were living in Phoenix. Now, at one point, they lived in Oklahoma, and my mother, Frida Christine was her name, but she always went by Christine. So they lived in Oklahoma for a while, and of course it was a wild territory at the time too. Then Grandpa evidently got a job as a high school teacher of business in Phoenix, Arizona, and they moved. And they had a nice house and bought some land. Well, I told about Grandma having cows and chickens, of course. So, and they actually sold the eggs from the chickens that they had. But they had 7 children, and of that number, 3 passed away, leaving only 4 girls. I had my Aunt Virginia Lee, my Aunt Margaret Ann, and Aunt Mary Jo. So when I was born, I was named, my father wanted to name me after the 3 sisters. I was Virginia Joanne, and that's how I got my name. So, my father's family lived in West Virginia, and I can't remember how they got to Arizona. My grandfather had, on my father's side, had a grocery store in West Virginia, and I don't know if he wanted to get a new start or what, but they ended up in Arizona, and there was the young people were having a little get together at someone's house, and my dad met my mother, and my mother thought he was just so amazing. He was 5 years older than she, and he had a car. So she thought he was just amazing.
That would have been in 1917 or so?
Oh no, my mother was born in 1913.
Oh, so well, still
So
the
this is-
1920s.
Yeah, it was
to have
in
a
the
yeah.
20s.
So to have a car then would have been,
Yeah.
you know, it's cool now to date a boy who has a car, but then, wowzers. Yeah.
And Daddy was working at a grocery store. So, well, eventually they married. My mother didn't finish her college education at that time. They decided she could get a job teaching without having a college degree. So they got married on Christmas Day.
Huh.
I can't remember the year. I think it might have been it was in the 30s actually, because my brother was born my oldest brother was born in 37, and I was.
Oh, this is later than I thought. Huh, yeah.
And I was born in 1940.
Huh.
So, my father after they married, my father was going up in the officials of this Safeway Corporation, and he was given the managership of a grocery store in Flagstaff. So they moved to Flagstaff, which is just an hour or two north of Phoenix, of course. So it wasn't too far from home. And my brother was born in Phoenix, and I was born in Flagstaff. So, gosh, in 1940, that was the year that the Great World War II began, and people had to use food stamps because they were rationed a certain amount of sugar, a certain amount of flour for each family, and Mother and Daddy eventually had 4 children, so they'd get the ration stamps for all 4 children. We had a nice variety of food, and of course Daddy worked he was the manager of the Safeway store. So when I was about 6, my Uncle Rob, we called him Uncle Rob, Robinette was his last name. Oh, that was my grandmother's maiden name on my mother's side, Robinette. Yeah. And he had a freezer plant. People would go deer hunting or have other reason, and they could rent a locker in a freezer plant. And my Uncle Rob owned a freezer plant in Albuquerque, and it had space for a grocery store. So he came to my father, I remember when he visited, and he wanted my father to come to Albuquerque and open a store. And that was, my father thought that was a great opportunity, so we moved the family to Albuquerque, and we lived in a little bitty tract house, and in Albuquerque at that point we were the last street before the desert. We just looked out on the desert, and I don't think we lived there even 2 years, but Mother had a whole living room added to that little house. Then as things, it wasn't a comfortable house. It was so small. So my parents found a house in what we call the valley in Albuquerque that was much closer to my father's store. So the thing is, my father had the store, and his failure or his weakness, because the store was not really in a good location, to tell the truth. It was in a poor section of the city. But he would give credit to people that couldn't afford to buy the food, and then they wouldn't pay him. And gradually the store just failed. When he still owned the store, one of my uncles came to visit because my mother was also working in the store just as a clerk. And that uncle said to her, well, why don't you finish your education and become a teacher? It would certainly earn more than what you what you mean as a clerk in the store. So she managed to finish her education, and she became a teacher. And Daddy eventually closed the store, and then he worked for another grocery store as the meat market manager and butcher. So that's what Mother was still teaching, and Daddy was working at that store. When I grew up, I was finishing high school, and then I went away to college. I wanted to become a homemaking teacher because I had really enjoyed homemaking in high school. Our dog is...
They have a new dog in the house, and she's still in her puppy years and just wants to get in on all this. So
be on TV.
Right.
That's why she's sticking her nose up under the table.
Her name is Bonnie Blue Eyes, a tricolored beagle.
With blue eyes.
Blue eyes.
So anyway, then I went away to college at New Mexico State. It was called
New Mexico A&M.
A&M, and then they changed the name the year that
We were there.
we were there. I met Charlie, and we married, and that's the beginning of our family.
Uh-huh.
So I guess that's really,
Pretty good.
I can't think of any other particular stories about the family. Maybe I'll think of some more later.
That was very concise. Thank you very much.
Good.
There's a history of our two trees. I'm very pleased. Thank you all.
Yeah, there are 4 grandparents for each of us.
That's right. Remarkably, 3 of my great-grandparents were alive when I was born.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
longevity is in our family.
That's
so
true.
Do you remember your grandma Glass?
Oh, very well. Sure.
Yeah.
Grandma Glass was still alive when I started college. She was still alive when I was 19.
Oh wow.
And when I was a child, we went out to visit her, and she had land. She had a big yard
Yeah.
with date trees.
Right.
And I think I was 8 or 9 years old, and I went out and put a big ladder up there and picked dates.
Yeah.
And I clearly remember that.
Sure, that's great.
That's great. Yeah.
So thank you all for sharing those, and we'll have some more sessions with more stories.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
a deal. Nothing like family history.
That is very true.